Howdy, folks. Welcome back. I am Ross Weaver. I'm here in my 15th lecture of my Metal Gear Solid V Explained series, where I've been going over all the missions of the Phantom Pain one by one and explaining how each of these scenarios relates back to all of this secret stuff that happened around and after 1975 in the Ground Zero scenario, and what all that shows us. Now, today we're going to talk about missions 30, and I'm going to try and talk about 31. I've got 3 pages of notes, so we'll see how this goes. I'm going to try and get through most of Skullface's speech and comment on it, and talk about a lot of stuff with what's going on with Mission 31 and why the whole battle with Sahelanthropus is depicted in the way it is, and kind of the final recipe, you might say, of what all this leads up to. But first, before we get there, we've kind of got to talk about the timeline and what just happened at the end of Mission 29. So during the game, we get Code Talker back after the Metallic Archaea mission ends, and he cures the whole linguistic parasite outbreak that's on our base. And after that's done, there's kind of this just fade to black and this cut, and then it fades back up to Snake and Miller doing a little walk and talk out on the command platform, heading towards the chopper. And Miller's like, we found Skullface and we're going after him. He's got to pay. We've got to wipe out all trace of existence, and we have to stop him before it's too late. So I'm guessing that the code talker that Frank picks up in the 70s is probably Zero. Zero had probably been captured at some point, maybe during the whole campaign, and had to get rescued. And he's the one who probably was able to cure all the parasite problems. But then he probably had to go sort of off the radar and help track down wherever Boss was going to pop up next, because they didn't catch him in Rhodesia. Essentially, Boss gets away. He does all of his research stuff, and he gets whatever his next stage of his research was. He had taken the prototype Chico and developed him into an actual drone reproducible super soldier kit, and now he's got that, and he's left Rhodesia, and we've got to go find out where he is. So there's kind of a timeline jump that happens back in the 70s, and there's also an area of operations switch. Now, it gets kind of crazy, but what probably happens here is kind of a dual telling of what happened in Mission 30, or Episode 30. It's kind of a dual telling of what happens in both 1984 and 1994, this is kind of crazy, but the only time we're told that Skullface dies in the timeline is in 1984. So we know that this mission tells us some of what's going on in 84. So what that means is that after the 77 campaign ends, or after the late 70s campaign in Rhodesia ends in 77, there's this time jump. And we're told that there's, in the timeline, an Iran revolution in 79, and Eli escapes. And then there's this double flash spotted in the Indian Ocean. So that tells us that Big Boss probably kept his whole deal going. Now, we're told President Somoza has defected in 79, and there's not a lot of context as to why they include that in the timeline. Well, I think President S kind of is a reference to Solidus. So George was probably on the Zero side leading up to 79, and probably betrayed the Zero side and defected over to the Soviet side. And this is probably what sparked more conflict after 77, in 79. The double flash is indicative of 2 more Foxhound soldiers being made. So we know Chico's been made, and that was the main test. And also he's that's like Fox and Wolf in the first test. So the double flash in 79 probably indicates 2 more of them being made. And so this is probably maybe where Decoy Octopus and Vulcan Raven were made, or maybe even maybe Vamp was made actually here. He may not have been made before, but him being a copy snake indicates that he could have been made before here. via all of the child soldier Chico stuff. Maybe he was like the one successful mature soldier or something like that. But all of this kind of Iraq leads to like an Iraq-Iran war in 1980. And this is probably also tied up in a little bit in what's going on here in Mission 30 in Skullface. And maybe provide some context as to, in the timeline they say the West and the Soviet Union helped Iraq. So maybe that has something to do with what was going on in the greater Cypher conflict, and maybe the West being like the Zero faction and the Soviet Union maybe being like an Ocelot-led version of the Soviet faction help Iraq. It's kind of hard to say though, but there's more conflict, and I can't go over it all. It's just too much to talk about. We got to get going. But basically, it seems that all this conflict that happened in 79 to 84 comes to a head in 84. And it appears that would be when Big Boss was probably finally stopped. I'm not going to say he was killed because the timeline doesn't say he was killed. I think he was stopped. We'll get to it, but I don't think he's, like I say, I don't think he's really easily killable. But we know Quiet's burned, Skullface dies. There's a lot of stuff happening listed in the 1984 stuff in the timeline at the end of the game, so that's kind of going to give us some context as to why all this is happening. Now, all that also stands in for what we're doing really in the game is happening in 1994. Now, in the timeline, it tells us from 90 to 95, there's like a series of events. The Gulf War starts, and Eli and David deploy, and the Soviet Union dissolves in 91. So Eli's already deployed. We've already done that. South Africa acknowledges that they have nukes and pledges to disarm in 93. That's probably what's going on in the sort of like the post-mission stuff after the Code Talker mission and after Metallic Archaea. So that's probably the whole acknowledgement of nukes and pledging to disarm is probably the cure, right? So in 94, then what happens is the Taliban forms. So in 94, that's kind of like, it's sort of like if Big Boss and Zero were fighting, and Big Boss kept popping up somewhere with his experiments, and then Zero would go after him and sort of do the whack-a-mole thing and try to stop him. 94 with the Taliban forming is like another one of those events. And so I think that refers back to probably what happened in 84, maybe even in 83, because we're told in 83 the U.S. invades Grenada. That may have been the final invasion of wherever Big Boss was scheming. And it ends with Big Boss being stopped. Snake awakens. The third boy crashes in Ukraine. Quiet is burned. Skullface dies. So the third boy crashing in Ukraine was probably Big Boss had made tretage and was sending him off to be weaponized. And so that's probably what was going on there. That's probably where he was actually made. And he wasn't actually really totally irradiated until 86. Which is kind of crazy, but it seems like he was probably out there for a couple of years before they could track him down and bring him in. Which we'll get to again later. But anyways, so all this stuff in Iraq and Iran kind of, the Iran Revolution is kind of likened to the Big Boss, rebellion happening again, essentially. And all this stuff going on in the proxy wars. So, Mission 30 kind of tells us the ending, like the 84 kind of stuff. But it also, it's really, like I said, it's literally 1994. So think of this as like, this is the setup to the fall of Outer Heaven. Is really what this is. It's actually not happening like right here in front of, we're not in 95 yet, but what we're going to see here is kind of a setup for our own fall, essentially. So, now, where is this happening, though? Well, I think that, given all the Iraq-Iran stuff, it's probably happening somewhere around Iran. Boss probably pops back up in Iran, allied with all of them, and that happening in 79 kind of would make sense as to maybe why there was a whole nother campaign and why the Iraq stuff was important and why these two sides, allied against this other side. So maybe Big Boss had kind of been kicked out of the sort of Soviet side of things, so to speak. Which means Zero and Ocelot were probably working together at this point against Big Boss. So this is probably happening somewhere in the Middle East, and that's why it's like a return to Afghanistan. It's not literally Afghanistan that was happening in the 80s, and where we are in the 90s is probably literally Iraq. As in, it's like what we're doing in the 90s is like a follow-up to the stuff that happened back then. And I'll get to it, but we're kind of covering up what's happened in the past via this stuff here in the future, in the 90s. Really in the present. Think of it as the present. So all this 94 stuff that we're going to see here in Skullface is sort of like his setup for his the final flourish of his whole cover-up and his whole redaction of the mutiny, but also, it's like it's the securing of his own legacy as well within the history of all of this stuff. So this really is just telling us about the story of Snake confronting Boss at the very end of things. Now, in the 90s, we know the Russians weren't in Afghanistan. They weren't really in any of these places like Iraq and Iran. That's why I think we have English-speaking American Special Forces depicted here in OKB-0. There's no Russians here. They say they've released the Russian, linguistic parasite, but there's no evidence of that. There's no bodies being burned anywhere. There's nothing like that. So, take that as much as you want, I guess. But all this stuff kind of indicates that Fox and Ocelot are working together for this operation. Maybe Zero was, back wherever he was in his base, and Ocelot and Fox were out in the field, and they were going to go stop Boss. So, note here in this mission, there's lots of walker gears along the way. So Boss is, he's still using his exoskeletons. This relates also to the mission tasks. There's 4 walker gears. There's 3 inoperative tanks there, which it should be a callback to Mission 9, where we had 3 tanks and back up, back down come at us. And there's other missions as well where we had 3 tanks. I can't remember off the top of my head where they were. But the 3 tanks thing has come up again, and they're empty. And it's a relation. It's a symbolic way of speaking of the 3 vials of the linguistic parasite. There are 7 red containers that you have to pick up. And again, 6 + 1, 7 red containers. This is all of the research data for all of the Foxhound soldiers that Boss has probably made up to this point. It's 7 for us at this point because we're doing it, like I said, in the 90s. And so all 7 of them have been made. Back then, they might not have actually made all 7. Because I'll get to it another time. But the timeline only indicates that Boss only made maybe 3 or 4. So the 7 red containers probably relate to the 7 Foxhound members and the research stuff used to create all of them. And that relates back to all the other missions like Close Contact and other ones where we've picked up, parasite-related people and parasite-related stuff and gotten containers as part of the mission tasks. I want to note real quick, I'll get back to it. There's also a tape that you have to pick up for a mission task at the very end at the tower, and it's self-referential. It's Heaven's Divide. It's Peace Walker tape. So that just ties back in again with all the other times I've been talking about picking up tapes at the tower and the tape behind Chico's cell being the self-reference back in Ground Zeroes and the hidden diamond and everything. This is the hidden thing. It's a Peace Walker reference is there because of this character. Fox's origin is really shown in Peace Walker as Chico. So I want to make a quick note about the structure of this mission and this outpost. It's a big old straight line. And now, if you've been playing this game up to this point in the sneaky, stealthy way, and you've been crawling your way through all these outposts, this mission will take you for frickin' ever. It's a hard mission to sneak through on your first time. Now, if you know the routes, there's a really easy few ways to sneak through here. There's some cool little ways you can find via the geography. Actually, there's little hidden paths and climbable places and things like that where you can kind of find your way around a lot of the more heavily guarded areas. But my favorite way to play this level is to just run it straight down the middle. There's a road going right down the middle, and it's pretty heavily guarded, but a lot of the guards are also a little bit off to the side of that road, such that if you just truck it down the middle and you don't let a full alert go out until you get past, say, the third door, you can, and if you've got, say, parasite armor on, you can just easily run it all the way to the very end. And parasite armor doesn't limit your mission completion rank, so you can still get an S rank. And so if you want to get an S rank on this mission, you really have to go super duper fast. You have to run it down the middle. You have to skip all the cutscenes because the cutscenes are long, right? And all the cutscene time is included in your mission completion score, which is kind of crazy, but they do that on purpose because it's like you have to know the story to S rank it, right? It's back to the whole knowing the script thing. And I also want to say that those doors, especially that very first door you pass in that outpost before you even really get into OKB-0, that big red one, is meant to recall Camp Omega's admin sector. And I've said it before, but this OKB-0 outpost is kind of a recreation of the admin sector of Camp Omega, yet again. And this rock power plant, which we're going to drive over to here in a bit, is like a recreation of the cells. So what we're doing here, actually, is what happened at Ground Zeroes. Is probably when since we're Chico, this is probably going to depict what happened to Chico. Now I'll get to it elsewhere, but Chico may have broken out of his cell at some point and tried to escape or something like that. But what's going on here is not that. What's going on here is probably that he was brought to the admin sector and probably was either tortured or forced to torture. Something bad happened to him, and afterward, and Big Boss did it to him, and afterward, I think that he was put in the Jeep. Big Boss gets in the Jeep, and they drive back down to the cells, and that's where the Ground Zeroes cinematics that we see pick up. Is when Chico's taken out of the Jeep and deposited back in the cells. So we're seeing all the lead up to that point here in the Skullface mission, and this whole structure of this speech symbolically is meant to recreate that. So that's why when we get to the end and we get up to the tower, there's no conflict. It's kind of they pull the rug out from under you. And so this is kind of like shades of Snake's return back to base after he's completed his mission. He's gone to the main tower. He gets up there, and who does he find? It's his boss, and he's been betrayed. And he doesn't shoot him because it's his boss, right? So, and then there's this whole speech. So it's Chico and his torture and afterwards, but it's also Snake's return to base after rescuing Chico and stopping all this stuff and then seeing this is what's happened. So that part about where Skullface leaves from the tower, this is the part that's at the tower and kind of reveals to us it wasn't just Huey and Skullface in the tower. It was sort of like Snake was there with Big Boss and Zero. That's probably what was going on. And we find out there's this big betrayal and all this. So, but Skullface's speech has nothing to do with that. He's talking symbolically about really himself, because at this point in the game, we don't realize that we are Skullface. And so what he does is he tells us sort of like, he knows that we're so programmed that we won't understand him just telling us this stuff that we'll call BS. So he's like, this is why I will show you my demon. He's going to like sort of symbolically tell us that we're the same. He says, follow me, Big Boss, because he knows who he is. He knows that this is Chico, really. How could he recreate all this stuff if he's not either one of those two guys that was in the Jeep, right? And in a way, it's like he's showing himself what his own lost memories are by acting all this stuff out. Since Venom's lost his memories, can't remember what all happened, he has to kind of have it shown to him, and that's what Skullface is practically kind of doing on one level here. Now, let me pause real quick because it's going too fast. Skullface mentions that... Oh, yeah, all of this, Skullface knowing that this is Venom, old Fox knowing that this is young Fox kind of also goes back to implying that maybe Big Boss back then knew that Medic was Null, was Fox, really. And maybe was kind of wise to what was going on a little more than Fox even realized back then. Boss might have even realized that there was two Foxes, but probably not. He probably didn't fully realize it back then. Maybe in 84, though. Maybe by then he had figured out a lot of Zero's crazy stuff, and what the perfect soldier data had in it and all that stuff. But maybe not. It's kind of hard to say since Skullface is speaking symbolically here. So we start following him, and he tells us, whatever the Navajo told you is just one solution arrived at by their cipher system. His will is different. So this is really about differentiating Fox from Zero and Fox's authorship and all of this stuff that's already happened and is going to happen, differentiating his authorship from Zero. And really that's more about differentiating the player's authorship in the games from the creator's authorship in the games, which, the players do have their own place in authoring Metal Gear's history. None of it would have happened without players. So, in a way, Big Boss is kind of the players, and Zero is the creator, but also Snake is kind of likened to the players. So it's kind of hard. The players also kind of split between Big Boss and Snake a little bit. And it seems like Big Boss is maybe more a certain type of player who's played it for a while and kind of is set in their ways and doesn't really change anymore. And they're kind of maybe not so fun to talk about because they only have their way of seeing it, And then Snake's coming along here, and he's more the younger guy who's, got his own way of seeing it, but also doesn't want to get in the way of other people's way of seeing it. That's kind of the stuff that I'm seeing a little more here, but differentiating those two personalities. And so in that way, Skullface is kind of more about Fox's own will and his own kind of his ego. But it's like consciously made. He knows that this is about his own ego, whereas maybe that wasn't the case for everybody else in the past that he's standing in for. Because he's not just standing in for Big Boss. He's also kind of Skullface is not just standing in for Big Boss here. He's also kind of standing in for Hot Coldman. And really Zero's own kind of, authorship and plans and stuff that he's made in the past. Okay, so he talks about Seleno Yarsk, Fox's first mission. Any mess he made, I was there to clean up. I think he means that literally. That's probably going to be Metal Gear Delta stuff, but he's implying that he was there in the past, but he's also using doublespeak. Everything he says here is meant to be symbolically a stand-in for something else. In fact, and then this is where the revelation should come for you, that every narrative line in this game, every little piece of story detail, is not there literally as what it is. It is there as a stand-in symbolically for something else. So nothing is what it is. A cone isn't a cone. It's a little straight rod, right? These XOF soldiers speaking English might not be XOF soldiers speaking English. And it's like a way of seeing all of this game as symbolic and not as literal. That's what Skullface is kind of trying to get us to realize here. And so that's what he's talking about. This history of Boss and Zero is really kind of about, what's been going on with the history of Metal Gear. And yeah, it relates to how Fox has been redacted, but also how the player's own authorship has sort of not been as present in the games because it just hasn't been able to be in a lot of ways. And so we're left with just whatever Zero does, right? We're left with just whatever sort of God gives us in the absence of our own will being able to be affected in the world in our own lives. So going down this little elevator with the four guys around you should be, if you remember Metal Gear Solid 1, when you're surrounded by the four guys with the stealth camo, that's the same thing going on here. And you're by yourself, meaning Skullface is you. So this whole thing about thinking that Skullface is a projection, that's something that Skullface kind of implies to get you to sort of fool yourself. And he talks about how there's systems of control that are being used by Zero here. He's also kind of using some of them while disparaging their own uses. But I think he also maybe sees them as like he has to use them. They're kind of inevitable. He makes this note here about unilateralism too, and I think that note about unilateralism goes back to how Big Boss was taking unilateral action with Cypher and all of its resources and stuff, and how that's kind of frowned upon. And usually Zero would do his stuff. If he was doing it unilaterally, he would kind of compartmentalize himself first, so that whatever unilateral actions he took wouldn't further damage the rest of the organization of Cypher or whatever else he was trying to do. So all this stuff about the Major seeking a information that uses information words to control the subconscious. He's really speaking about the lore of Metal Gear. He's talking about how Kojima's kind of carefully crafted and controlled this lore in a certain way so that we're kind of stuck with one way of interpreting it, really. Like, ultimately, in the end, the game is just, it is what it is, right? Where can the player really change the game? And that's really, this game's the answer to that. This game is the one where you can really change it. Because of all of this use of symbolism and the literal kind of not making sense on a surface level, it requires you to provide your own interpretation, sort of your own headcanon, just to fill in the gaps at first, just so this makes sense the first time you see this stuff, because you're like, what is happening? You're like, why is this happening? Who's this guy? Like, why are we just talking to him? Who is he? Like, what are we doing here? Where did all these helicopters and everything else come from? Well, I think all these helicopters and everything else were really here the whole time. We just couldn't see them because we've been doing a training operation kind of this whole time. It's like we're not really actually doing all of the Civil War stuff anymore. This is kind of the wrap-up of it. This is the cover-up. So it's kind of all an act. And so it's likened to a training exercise in a way. And I think that's why there's so much emphasis on like hallucinations in VR. So Skullface's speech here is now getting into stuff about Chico, really. But he's really using Big Boss's cover. And he's talking about himself as if he's Big Boss. And he's using all of Big Boss's Hungarian history and all of Big Boss's own trauma as his trauma. Sort of his cover for his own trauma. And talking about how the stuff that's happened to him kind of relates back to what happened to Big Boss. But he has his own way of seeing it that's a little bit different, and so that's why it's kind of presented in the way that it is. It's just these words, and he's, like I said, he's recreating the past, literally, as a kind of revenge on his own past. Like, he can't really go back in time and stop all the stuff that's been done to him. Nobody can, right? But you can go forward and kind of make your own mark on the world. And that kind of gets into the whole, what's the use of Sahelanthropus thing and how it's just kind of a mark for what they did. So all of this stuff about codes and lore and, Skullface's past being stole from him and his future being revenge is about basically saying Fox is not going to hide forever. He's been hiding up to now. The player's kind of been, we've not really been able to really super elegantly affect our will on these games, right? Like, we're only left to affect our will on the games in the ways that they allow us to. And so in a way, Skullface is trying to kind of say that in the future, the players themselves will be the ones that will be able to actually determine the story. And that's kind of what his will is. Now, I don't know what that means, literally as in, like, are we going to write the next Metal Gear game? There's probably layers of meaning to that. Maybe more like your choices in future Metal Gear games will be less restricted. Maybe, it's something about more like that. Obviously they're still going to have stories and scripts and stuff like that for us to follow. But what this is more about is, about leaving room for interpretation, leaving room for the player's own perspective in these games. And that's why I think this whole theme of phantom pain is there. It's not just there to provide an emptiness in the game and reinforce this kind of like darkness and all this sadness and stuff like that. It's also there literally as a space for you to fill with your own imagination. It's there for your kind of your own headcanon, for your own will, and for your own just fun, really. It's a game. So have fun with it. And that's what the final parasite is the word made flesh. it knows English. The Word made flesh now. Let's okay. Well, I'm going ahead of myself. Look, he's talking about unifying the world. His will by his lore becoming known is sort of to bring all of us into unity in how we see Metal Gear. He knows that after this game comes out, it's like there's going to be chaos and all this stuff comes up. And that kind of relates back to, when the mutiny happened, there was all this chaos and all this schism within Cypher, which is kind of like schisms within the fandom, and schisms within individual fans and things like that. And so this is more about unifying all of that and sort of filling in the gaps and making it so that people don't have to just argue over what is and isn't canon anymore and can more speculate over what might be canon in these gaps where we agree that there are gaps in certain places, but then in between those gaps, we're not like arguing over what is and isn't really there, which is kind of what's been going on. And his whole speech kind of tells us that he knows that that's what's going to happen. This war is peace, right? But that's kind of the point. So that's what really the 1984 thing is about. Control and unity in the book is kind of depicted as like, unity is enforced through like ignorance, really, and through just like subservience and just unquestioning following of the masters and all of that. And that's kind of how control is depicted there. But what Skullface is kind of advocating for here is the opposite of that. A type of control where individuals make their own choice to join a collective. And that's why he was talking about America and all that. The mother tongue, really, being English, is kind of like the mother tongue of Metal Gear's lore. He's kind of talking about things like, the parasites becoming something we just talk about when we talk about the lore of Metal Gear now, because that was kind of a secret thing up until this game. We talked about nanomachines a little bit, and we knew nanomachines were there, but we didn't have like a real full history of them and where they came from and what the heck they're really capable of. We kind of just saw nanomachines before the Phantom Pain as like just sort of a fill-in-the-gap thing for, cool sci-fi technology thing that we don't fully understand or have yet. And it still is kind of that, but that's also really just a stand-in for, like I said, it's a stand-in for your imagination. The nanomachines kind of are this void and this gap. So they kind of are that Phantom Pain. It's artifice itself, you see. And so you're supposed to fill that in yourself, and that's what kind of really the mother tongue of Metal Gear lore is about. Solid Snake tells us to write, and at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, you don't need to obsess over words too much. You got to find the meaning behind them and then decide. And that's kind of what Skullface is telling us here. Is that he's going to tell us that we can decide the meaning up to this point, or after this point. But we won't really understand that. It's like he's telling us we'll go through a whole process to get there, and this is what this is all about, and why we don't understand everything, and why his speech is so, just vexing. It seems like he delivered it to the wrong guy, and it's all missing context and stuff like that. Your imagination has to fill in all of those gaps yourself. And in the process, you kind of become Skullface when you do that. And that's the point. And so that's the idea of the Word made flesh. Is it's really about how the Word made flesh is a quote from Scripture, from the Bible, John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And that's really about God, really about Jesus. It's about the divine becoming human. It's about, memes and words becoming reality, right? Ideas becoming real. And that's kind of what Venom himself is about. He was, Chico was kind of the metaphorical, young boy Jesus. And Venom Snake here is kind of the metaphorical, middle-aged adult, soon-to-be sacrificed Savior Jesus. And the soon-to-be sacrificed part we know comes in 95. If this isn't happening in 94, this is all about, kind of Jesus' temptation by the devil right before his crucifixion. That's kind of what's going on here. And also, in a way, Skullface is kind of crucifying himself, but we'll get to that later. But like, the crucifixion itself is here as like a, a cleansing of sins. It's a forgiveness of wrongdoing. It's about literally wiping out the mutiny and all of the sins. And like I said, how back in Mission 20, how Skullface himself is sort of taking on the sorrow of those who mutinied and killing them, but also like he's able to sort of cleanse that mutiny's emotional effect himself. He's sort of taking all of their sins in himself, and then by dying himself and then transforming, he's kind of tricking the devil in a way. And that's tricking the devil is a big thing. I'm going to get back to it here in a sec. The final parasite also relates to the Patriots and their whole like systems of control. It's kind of like his way of getting around it. He's like, once I've got this done, this developed, there's no way that they're going to be able to stop me. It's like his lore will be set. And no matter what context the Patriots add on top of it, his structure will still it'll hold up. It'll still be there. And this relates back to lingua franca. He has a line here. He says, sans lingua franca, the world will be torn asunder, and then it shall be set free. Well, we know in lingua franca, there's all the glitches and stuff like that, and that mission's kind of tough. So that's kind of, it's a reference to that mission, and it's a reference to his self-identity. In the English language and Metal Gear's lore, and how he's kind of written himself in it now, and Sahelanthropus will be his final mark on, by which he sort of flourishes his signature, and there will be no erasing it from that point. And so this whole thing really is a drama depicted about God, Jesus, and the devil. God is really kind of depicted as Zero, and Jesus is really Fox. Both of these are kind of depicted as Jesus. And Skullface is kind of the devil, but really the devil is also Big Boss. And this is about tricking Big Boss. So this is about tricking Big Boss from sort of, Big Boss was trying to make his mark and make his legacy, felt on the world via all of his revolutions and all of his rebellions and mutinies and stuff like that. And I think this kind of is what this mission's commentary on. Skullface is the one who's actually stomping out all of that stuff, though. And by stomping it out, he's the one who's making his mark felt on the world and leaving his mark. So he's kind of a little bit of a hypocrite, but he's not, because he's not doing it for the same reasons that Big Boss did. Big Boss was doing it to change everybody else's lives and like force his will on everybody else. Skullface is kind of doing that, but it's a linguistic. It's not a physical forcing his revenge on everybody else. It's just the linguistics of it. He's doing no more damage than somebody going into a town square and making a speech. He's, and when that guy's right and everybody else is wrong about something, and he's sort of like condemning all of the people around him for being bad people. Maybe they're like, they hung somebody that was innocent or something like that. And somebody's like, you were all terrible people. And it's like, well, he's not going to really make much of a difference, but he's right. But everybody hates him for it. That's kind of how I see Skullface here. But he knows that Skullface here, I think, like I said, he knows that people are going to hate him for this because he's like, this has got to be done, essentially. There's no letting Big Boss's legacy live on, because that'll mean more parasite soldiers and more parasite weapons getting out in the world. And all that stuff has to be suppressed. So that's why I think they stopped calling them parasites and started calling them nanomachines after this. Why they're called nanomachines for the rest of the time. Because that's, nanomachines are a little more like, oh yeah, we created them and we control them and we programmed them. It sounds a little safer, It's like the PR department kind of got fired up and was like, we got to rebrand parasites, y'all. They're problematic and they're going to get canceled. So that's kind of what Skullface's whole speech is about. Skullface knows all that's about to happen, and he's like, they're going to rebrand all of this. They're going to cover up the mutiny, which includes Fox's origin, you see, and how he came to be at all. And he's like, well, that's kind of a problem because, like, I'm a part of this whole game's lore, this whole series lore too. Where's my place in it? And there hasn't been one there. Think of Metal Gear Solid 4, how there was no place for Hideo, and no place for whoever in all those promos. I think the hidden one there's no place for Fox, and that's kind of, like I said, it's been going on throughout all of Metal Gear. So that's mission 30 enough. There's more at the end of the speech. I'm just gonna skip it. Y'all can go back and watch it if you want to get the end parts of his speech. But essentially, he makes a reference to Salino Yarsk, really, with Remember the Alamo once he arrives at Sirach Power Plant. And like I said, Sirach Power Plant is like the cave. It's inside Chico's head. There's this nice shot that you get when they both get out of the Jeep, where it shows Sahelanthropus and the two of their heads in frame all together, kind of implying that Sahelanthropus was a product of Chico's head. It was like it itself was an idea that came from his imagination, probably while he was held captive back in Camp Omega. So what all is happening here in this cave at the end of this Mission 30 in Skullface is shown to us again at the beginning of Mission 31. And it's kind of like we see the part where we drive in and what happens in the cave first. We see that perspective. And then in Mission 31, when it starts, we see outside the cave. There's like a to be continued at the end of 30 when Sahelanthropus roars at at Snake. And again, in my video, I've got a skin of Fox here. But the part that's happening outside of the cave is sort of omitted from the Mission 30 narrative. And that whole idea of, omitting part of the narrative and then bringing it in later, that relates to the whole, this is what's going on with the mutiny, is they essentially cut up the mutiny's narratives into a bunch of parts and rearrange it and then reproduce it in a certain way in just sort of these slices, right? Where you get a little cross-section of what happened here, but you don't get the full perspective, and you kind of have to put it together yourself. But also in that way, they're literally diluting the legacy of all the mutiny, all the bad stuff. So I'm gonna go through here. When the mission starts up, we're in the chopper, and there's three people in the chopper. It's Eli, who is kind of the subject of the shot when it starts up, and sitting next to him in the back is Huey, and then in front of them, kind of facing 90 degrees the other direction, is Miller. We don't see Miller, but his leg, a little bit of his torso and his cape and an arm and his crutch. Now, this shot is very carefully choreographed such that Huey and Miller are superimposed. In other words, Miller's body and his props and stuff are actually covering up parts of Huey in the frame. So superimposing those two in the frame is implying to me that there's a link between Miller and Huey. And like I've said, if Frank's cause was zero, well, this would make sense. This is why they're being superimposed, because our Huey is zero. Cause and zero being superimposed means like cause is zero. So this is like going back to Mission 29 and the recipe of who all was in the helicopter when it crashed. Chico was in the helicopter, Zero was in the helicopter, and he was cause, and there's this Huey there. So who's the Huey? That's just these three. Well, so that likens Huey really to Snake, actually, because we know Huey is symbolically the weapons engineer, right? He's the systems designer. So who was the designer of this whole plan? Well, it was probably Fox himself. Fox was probably the one who was scripting all of what was going on there at the end. It's probably him that put the bomb in pause. And, he probably did that as a mercy to her, actually, more than anything, to transform her and Chico and to, give them a way out. But also, it might not have been Fox Snake. Because Huey's, likened to Zero, and Zero's likened to Cause and all of this stuff, there's also kind of a way of seeing Huey as like Big Boss himself, too. Like I said, we know Big Boss was the one who was really making these Foxhound child soldiers. It was really his will that was being carried out. Maybe he had his own Huey that was probably like Sokolov, and maybe this kind of implies that there's a version of the helicopter crash where Sokolov's in a helicopter and it crashes. But we don't ever really see something like that I can really think of off the top of my head. Maybe somebody can help me there. So this makes me think it's more about Zero and about Big Boss. They're the ones whose big designs really are going on here to me. So this is probably more about, how Chico was made. And we're going to find out more about Big Boss here in a sec. So really this all is, you could say it's like it's about control, right? With Trettage and his control of Sahelanthropus being snatched away from Skullface and Eli taking over. Skullface is, like I said, he's kind of like Fox's ego, right? And so this is kind of like the ego losing control to the young self, the younger version of yourself, which is like your inner child, right? Which really is likened to the id. So this is really more about, this is kind of a morality play, actually. And it's about how somebody's gone berserk. So what this relates to for Big Boss in 84 is Big Boss probably had some kind of a plan to build like a super soldier. He probably wasn't satisfied with his little drone soldiers, right? I think he had a plan to build his own style of Metal Gear, like a big robot, but I don't know if he actually wanted to build a big robot. Indications are he may have lost Sokolov at this by 84. And if he had lost Sokolov by 84, because essentially what's going on is between 77 and 84, there was a whole other cycle of all these events that we go through in the Phantom Pain in Afghanistan. It happens again, and one of those events is over the fence, which means whoever the engineer was that was working for Big Boss gets taken back. So that's probably where we get Sokolov back, actually. Is somewhere in maybe the 80s, early 80s, maybe the late 70s. During that whole metaphorical Iran Revolution phase. When we're in Iraq. So Iraq was probably like the battleground, and Iran was probably the base for Big Boss, and he was probably fighting a proxy war in Iraq. And that's why Iraq itself got support from the West and the Soviets, like locals, and they supported them locally. So whatever Big Boss's plan was in this region probably, again, revolved around the super soldiers, but it was probably, making his own like Metal Gear version of a super soldier. Essentially, I think he was making a giant version of Chico. I think he was going to make a giant drone Chico. And I think this is where he got the name Big Boss, is I think he'd always had the idea of like sort of a Godzilla-type monster in his own head, and he just never was able to make it in the past with like these machine Metal Gears. And so I think he kind of said, "Screw it, we'll do a biological one," essentially. And so I think he made like a giant Chico, sort of a Goliath. Okay, and I think that's what Sahelanthropus is a stand-in for, essentially, from relating this Mission 31 back to 1984. Which I know is crazy, but we'll get to it. The Man on Fire here is shown then with having a little face-off with Snake, because here in the Phantom Pain, the Man on Fire is literally sort of the manifestation of Fox's past trauma with Big Boss, of Chico's. So this is probably something that the Man on Fire is acting out that Big Boss did before. But Eli's in control here, so it's not clear that Eli has seen anything that the real Big Boss has done before. So maybe Eli's been told something that the real Big Boss did before as a memory of Chico's, and that was given to him, possibly. The way that Vogan's approaching him and then stops and then turns around and walks into Sahelanthropus kind of implies that it's like Boss maybe at some point is he's bringing out this giant weapon that he has, and he's like, "I'm not gonna kill you. This thing is." And he's like, and then Fox looks up and he's like, "Holy crap!" And then there's a big fight. And I think I think all of Foxhound were there, and they were working with Fox probably to stop whatever Big Boss's plan was, and it was probably a crazy fight. And since Fox is kind of, I think, his big genetic thing that I think of when he goes berserk is like the Fury, and he's going berserk here. And so I think he's just set off. It's even possible he was probably asked to fight Foxhound and maybe even do something that he didn't want to do. Maybe he was asked to kill himself. or something like that. But since he's a drone, it's not like really himself, but maybe the way this biological him was made was like a clone giant of himself, and he didn't fully understand what was going on. Essentially, I think this giant super weapon that Big Boss made got out of control, and it was some kind of a almost unstoppable biological type Metal Gear style weapon, sort of an Evangelion, sort of like one of the angels, really. And who's going to stop it? It's got to be Fox, right? Well, he tries, but I think he actually dies in this conflict. Old Fox probably tries to stop all this, but we'll get to it here in a sec. We're shown his death in kind of this weird little thing that happens for seemingly no reason. But first what happens is our metaphorical giant Chico breaks out of his cell, and Skullface is trying to get control back. Big Boss is like, we gotta corral this sucker, essentially. So he brings in all of his units. It seems like maybe Fox went in there and possibly like let him out of his cage, is what's going on, or it's kind of unclear as to how this would have happened back in the day. But it's probably a very similar, like, Fox arrives at a tower somewhere to have the big final conflict, and he's denied the conflict, and there's a conversation, and he has to make his way over somewhere else. And then this happens. And then there's this turn, right? And Boss's own super weapon, I think, just goes out of control and destroys his own troops. So, after all this fighting, there's this shot. Snake avoids like a couple of tanks. One's like chunked at him, and he's hiding behind a second one. And I think this second one is stomped on the front side by Sahelanthropus's foot. And the tank flies up, and it looks like it's going to squash Snake. And the camera cuts to the Skullface's perspective, and it looks like that tank falls on Snake, and we don't see him. And then Sahelanthropus just kind of acts like he doesn't have a target that he's trying to squash anymore, and starts doing other stuff and kicking other stuff around. And then Skullface starts giving his speech. So we're shown what appears to be Snake dying, but then he just shows back up after Skullface is killed, and he's not dead, right? Well, what I actually think happens is, at first, Fox is trying to run away from this berserk, super giant Chico thing, and he just can't get away. And he gets squashed. And then Boss has been trapped somewhere, and he tries to get away and can't, and he gets squashed. And remember how when Zeke tries to squash Big Boss can hold it up and throw Zeke way over wherever, but a biological parasite-made giant probably doesn't get stopped. That's probably why they made most of the Metal Gears out of metal, because by making them out of metal, it kind of denies the parasite this like extra power they can have. It's like a willpower. Your will kind of influences the parasites to do crazy stuff, kind of magic. So I think at this point, Boss gets squashed. I think most of his body was destroyed, and all that was probably left was like part of his head. And I think those remains were taken and sort of locked away somewhere, because I don't think that fully killed him, because he's made of parasites, and he's like probably super mad about it. So he probably wouldn't have like accepted death, because we'll see later with the Man on Fire and Volgan, these parasite people don't really die fully when they don't accept their own death. There has to be kind of an acceptance for true death to really happen. Volgan keeps coming back because he's seen Snake. He thinks that's Naked Snake, and so he remembers his life, so he thinks he's alive. And so that's why Volgan, as the Man on Fire, keeps acting out things during the whole game. Memories, essentially. But he's not acting out just his own memories. He's also acting out other people who have Volgan's DNA, mainly Fox. But he can also act out probably some of Big Boss's memories, because I think Big Boss gained Volgan's DNA after their fight in Selenoyarsk. So, if Fox is squashed and Big Boss is squashed, Who's this fox that gets into the Jeep and runs off and then stops Sahelanthropus? Which venom snake do we have left? Well, Quiet is Chico. So, the only person left really here is whoever Quiet was back then. So Quiet was probably the one that transformed the Joy, the transformed version of Paz, whatever she was after their explosion and all this stuff up to 84, whatever had happened up to there, maybe she was Sniper Wolf, I don't know. Probably wasn't Sniper Wolf yet, but whoever she was must have fought this giant Chico, which kind of makes sense. She'd be the best one to fight him if he was kind of in love with her. Even if Chico didn't really recognize who she was or know who she was, there'd be this internal link between the two of them, which would maybe make him less strong against her and her a lot stronger against him, you know? And so, in the way that I've been saying this whole time, that Sahelanthropus in its body kind of stands for Paz and Fox's parasite lineage, it's swapped here. In the past, the fox, the symbolic fox stand-in, the big Sahelanthropus was actually Chico. And his body, it was a big giant Chico, and the smaller person that is the player was actually the Joy. Well, really not the Joy, but the transformed version of her from 1984. Maybe we'll just call her Quiet. So that's what this whole fight is essentially Quiet fought a giant Chico and didn't kill him, but like beat him up enough to stop him, to sort of like make him accept a defeat so that he could be like captured and brought back to base. Now, this might actually be literally the real Chico. This might not, there's a chance this might not be a drone, actually. I've been saying this was a drone, and yeah, he was making drone soldiers, but in the timeline, it's indicated that after this whole revolution in 79, that, you know, Eli escapes, essentially. Well, that could be code for, you know, the young Chico, whatever transformed version he was in after the Africa campaign. In the way that we have our conflicts with him on the base and all that stuff happens and then he leaves, that could be a symbolic stand-in for Chico essentially deciding to leave and go join Big Boss's faction himself. Maybe that's what happened. And then while he was there, they did a bunch of experiments on him and turned him into a giant. And then he went berserk. Maybe he was asked, you know, maybe a bunch of truths were revealed about what had been going on. And maybe, you know, maybe Quiet was there, and the whole thing was like, you know, Big Boss was ordering him to kill her, and he was like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then goes berserk, and, you know, this whole thing happens. Or something like that. It's hard to say exactly what happened, but I've already talked about the occupants in the chopper, but at the end I want to mention again just the occupants in the chopper and this whole presence of the chopper is kind of meant to recall the Ground Zero's context, and this is really kind of a wrapping up, a sort of of the whole loop that started in 75. It ends in 84. It's a 9-year thing, right? And so that's, I think, where the 9-year meme really came from. Is there was like a 9 years where Chico was just kind of out on the run and just kind of crazy, like stuff happening to him, crazy stuff happening in the world, and he was kind of his own dude. And then there was this conflict between Big Boss and Zero happening, and Fox was trying to help with all that, and things just got really bad. And here at the end, I think literally everybody was killed except for Quiet and this giant version of Chico, and it took her to stop him. And it was probably a hell of a fight, because he probably tries to stomp on her, and she probably has the will to actually stop his foot and like throw him off, because she's kind of like, she's the mom. She's going to be like, you dumb little I've had enough of your little, you know, tantrums, and you've killed my friends and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to stop it now. You're going to time out. And, you know, I think that's kind of what was going on here. So the fight ends. I've been watching the fight here, but I'm going to skip it and go to the end. And then Sahelanthropus is felled. And I think that's why there's a version of this cutscene, if you have Quiet as a buddy with you, why she's shown here in the kind of this hero shot beside Snake. In every version of the scene, if you've got her with you on the mission, she'll be right there. And I think that's kind of to be a nod to her role in '84 of stopping this what Sahelanthropus stands in for in the past, which is really probably a giant berserk Chico. And I say Chico, he didn't look like Chico, y'all. At this point, he would have transformed at least twice into probably some kind of bloody, crazy monster. I think that possibly provides some perspective as to why Sahelanthropus sounds like a monkey. He may have devolved a little bit in all of his like dehumanization that had been happening to him via the parasites. I think that the whole like him transforming into a monkey thing has possibly some Dragon Ball Z reference kind of thing going on, where it's like how the Saiyans can become giant monkey versions of themselves and go berserk, and they need to be stopped. I think that's kind of what's going on here. And what's being referenced here, kind of hidden beneath all of this stuff. So it's like, you know, we got Goku here trying to stop a crazy berserk giant Gohan monkey, you know? And he does, but not before like Master Roshi's squashed or something like that, you know? But an evil Master Roshi. Not really Master Roshi, somebody else, you know, Vegeta. Vegeta gets squashed. Big Boss would be more like Vegeta, I guess. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other video. So now we got to talk about Skullface's death scene. This will be the last thing we talk about. Thank goodness. We're almost there, y'all. So Skullface is there lying, dying, and he's got his canister and his gun and one bullet or a few bullets left. Snake, Kaz, and Huey get out of the chopper, but then the scene's mostly just Snake, Kaz, and Skullface, and really just Snake and Skullface. Snake opens up the canister and says there were 3. Where's the other? Now, y'all, this whole time we've seen this canister, there's only ever been 2 in there. So we never see a third. Where does Venom get the idea that there is a third? This idea of a third strain literally comes out of nowhere. It materializes. We go with it because Venom just says it and because all the rest of the characters talk about it, but we're never actually shown it. I think there is no third strain. It's a hidden thing. Really, there is a third strain, but it's not here. I'll get to it later, but... Well, no, I can't get to it later because we're about to say it. When Fox... Again, it's a gray fox skin in my video, y'all. I apologize if I keep calling him Fox. I'm trying to call him Snake here. Snake says, where's the other one? And Skullface says, very close to you, and points to him. Now, I've mentioned in my Metal Gear Decoded videos, this is all a reference to 24, the TV show about Jack Bauer, played by Kiefer Sutherland. Season 7 of it depicts Jack Bauer tracking down this weaponized biological... Well, it's a biological weapon. I can't remember exactly what it does, but it's like an aerosol, essentially. And Jack tracks down a big truck full of it first, one canister that has a bunch of it. And then after that truck is secured, they find that somebody had stolen one of the canisters that was being transported in the big container in the truck, and that one canister has to be tracked down later. So that's your second one. So there's your 2 physical versions of this virus or this biological weapon that we know of. And that's what the 2 vials in this mission stand for. The third one in the show is never actually shown because it's revealed that towards the end of the season that Jack was infected back when he was dealing with the first vial. Now the first truck, there was like a wreck, and in the wreck he has to like seal off the container because there's a leak that happens in it, but he's able to seal it off. And we don't find out till later that he was actually infected in that event. And that happens early on in the season. Now that's a reference to the hospital in the prologue. I'll get to it then, but Ishmael jabs Ahab with this thing that he calls digoxin, and it's not digoxin. It's the third strain. It's the English strain, and he already had it developed. Venom Snake cannot talk in the intro. He can only make caveman grunts. And then he's given this shot, and all of a sudden he can talk. The vocal parasite is what enables him to talk. He has to have his linguistic stuff given to him, actually. Part of that linguistic bug is the voice of Kiefer Sutherland. So that's where he gets the voice from. So that's why Skullface is like it's close, very close to you, and why he says that here. Um, this idea that there's two of them and a missing third, though, is really important, and it's one I'll go on a bunch about because the Phantom Pain is made up of two chapters, and then there's this third chapter called Peace that we all know about, but it doesn't exist, right? We never see any physical evidence of it, not really. And so that's kind of what's going on here. Peace is inside of you. It's not a physical, real thing that you're ever going to find in the game, because it's literally not in the game. It is symbolically in the game. That's what the message is here. So this missing third kind of relates back to how I was talking about how V has like a sort of these three triangles of three different people he sort of stands in for. How V himself is like a symbol, and since a V is 3 points, and each one of those points can be thought of as like the middle one is related to the other two. And how it's like the middle one is kind of Young Fox, and the other two are Old Fox and Zero, or it's Young Fox and then Vamp and Solidus, or Young Fox. And there's a bunch of ways. There's probably more than 3 triangles. I said there were 3 earlier. There's probably like at least 5 or 6 that you can think of. But all of this idea of threeness and triangles relates to how many shots can you give Skullface here. The game gives you the option to shoot him, and you can shoot him once, twice, or 3 times. And so that's why they only give you 3 shots. I think that also relates to like how many times you're really supposed to play through the game to sort of get it all. Like your first time through the game will just be for completion. Your second time through the game will be like developing all the rest of the stuff and sort of really getting to the real end game. Even though that one is kind of depicted as being the end game, we know that's not the real end game. The real end game is after you've developed everything, and then you go back and then play the whole thing again with everything from the start and knowing everything from the start. That's kind of the way you're meant to play this. But you can't do that the first time, and that's what the whole story is really about, is about learning to do it the third time and all of that. So, I also want to note that here, this shot of Skullface being shot by Kaz and Snake it's also it's a symbolic flashback to what happened to the end of the original Big Boss. So we know that he was probably crushed, and all that was probably left was his head. Maybe there were some body parts left, but it seems like this is where they really finished him off, and they finally like stopped his consciousness from rolling on and let him have a little bit of a rest. But again, he probably didn't fully die. He was probably like sort of in a coma from that point. That's probably where like the original Big Boss's coma really started. We know that this is a flashback to the past because literally when we're done shooting Skullface, the game scripted flashes back. Our Miller Cause flashes back to the guy from Peace Walker, who I think really was Zero with the other guy here. Venom Snake turns into really Ishmael, the snake from Ground Zeroes. And note his facial look here is all determined by the game. You don't have any influence on how he's shown here. And he looks just like Snake from Delta. The same cut and everything. Go check it out. Anyways, so this is Ishmael and Zero really stopping Boss's mutiny finally once and for all. And it seems like they probably just had to shoot him in the head to stop him from... It was probably like a talking head on the ground. It was probably terrifying. It's probably some kind of a zombie, gore fest movie feature thing going on. But if you take note here, after we're done shooting Skullface and we walk away, we leave him, and the reason why Kaz says do it yourself is because this whole game's theme is do it yourself. Like I said, you've got to fill in all of the gaps yourself, and you can't expect this game to spoon feed you everything. There's a lot that these Metal Gear games can give to you just on the surface level and can help you with, and a lot of stuff that you can learn just by playing it. But there's a lot more that you have to do yourself, that they give you the foundations for it, but they can't hold your hand through all of that stuff because it's a lot, and it takes a lot. But they have sort of symbolic structure in this game for all of that stuff if you can just take the time to find it and learn about it. And so the reason I'm saying that they probably had to shoot just a head back then is because whenever we walk away, we're shown that Huey goes towards Skullface's body while Kaz and Snake are walking away. And then after about a second, maybe a second and a half, Huey shoots Skullface in the head and finally kills him. And that's probably a replay of what he did in the past. He's got when we look back, he's got the exact same pose that we just saw Kaz making in our flashback. He's literally reenacting what we just saw. Also, if you'll note, the speed at which if you go back and watch when Huey walks out of frame, and you count in your head how long it takes for that gunshot to go off, and then think about all the things that Huey would have had to have done to get down to the ground, pick up the rifle, pick up the bullet, put the bullet in the rifle, load it, aim, and fire. There's clearly not enough time in the cutscene that we're shown for Huey to do all that, because we know his mechanical legs and his whole condition requires, it takes him a while to go from a standing position to a seated position. We see it the first time we meet him in Hellbound when we picked him up. He hits this switch and he's seated there, but it takes him a second to kind of stand all the way up. He didn't take all that time here to bend down, get the gun, and stand back up, and then turn 180 degrees and fire. So that seems to me to be another hint that this is Zero, and he had just done a Zero shift there, and he had put Old Fox out of his misery there. Finally, it was another mercy thing. Okay, so and that's about the end of that scene, and it's really somber and depressing. Actually, it's supposed to be a victorious moment where we finally defeated our greatest enemy, and it's a tragedy, And I think this relates back to the whole mutiny thing, that maybe Zero was mad that this all had happened up to that point. He was still in the emotion, in the center of it all, But Old Fox, he had kind of lived through all this before as a young person, and now was seeing it again from his older perspective. And I think he was sad to see that it came to this with Big Boss. I think he probably saw Big Boss as a pretty good comrade before all this mutiny stuff, and thought that maybe this guy isn't so bad. Maybe we can have a better time, this go around, and maybe the mutiny won't happen, and we can find a better way. And then it just happens, and he's probably super disappointed more than anything. At this point, there's been so much sadness, and now he has to kill who's probably a good friend of his, maybe, at this point. Even though his origins, were from all this torture and stuff, he's lived a lifetime and had a lot of time to get over it. And then he sees this other side of his own creation. And he's like, God, this is all just really sad. You can't really be mad for the world being a really screwed up place and that bringing sadness into your life, if there was nothing you could really do about it. And that sadness that was brought into your life maybe came from another person who also had bad stuff happening to them. It gets into how violence is a cyclical thing, really, and how we see eventually that if you react to violence with more violence, you don't cure violence. You only cure violence by breaking that chain of continuous violence, actually. You have to stop it by making a choice to sort of put down the gun. And that's kind of where, we get back to Peace Walker and all of that. Big Boss is saying to Kaz that the boss betrayed him and everything in her life up to that point when she put down the gun. We kind of see now that was really the source of his sorrow. That was the source of his problem. He saw that putting down the gun act as a bad thing. He himself had an inability to put down the gun, and that's kind of what all happened after all of this is what led is what that's what caused all of this that happened. It was his own inability to put down the gun is what led to all this sorrow and everything, and that's why Skullface then has to go do all the stuff that he does. But we get this nice victorious moment back at base where it seems like in '84, at least for a moment, they had brought everything back together and they had stopped everything, and it seemed like things were going to be all right for a little bit. And so that's why we get this nice, kind of victorious scene here at the end. Now, I want to mention, this is a shameless self-promotion, but I made a video of this mission that's got the Top Gun soundtrack queued up to this ending. And it's another one of those things that I think kind of syncs up, like the Africa song back in Mission 13 and a couple of others. This one seems pretty close, actually. Like maybe he really synced all this stuff up. I also want to note the blocking of that big hero walk when they go into slow motion, and who's superimposed on who implies more correlations between the characters, like I was talking about with Miller and Huey in the helicopter. Just go look at it yourself, but the character, when it's slowed down, it's very, very carefully choreographed so that the characters who are on top of each other are the ones that are symbolically likened to one another that I've been talking about this whole time. And the ones who kind of stand apart are the ones who are the more like, individual kind of symbolic, standing in for more individual characters and not a superimposition of a bunch of characters. And they you can go back and see they do this a lot throughout the whole game, but this is where it really comes to the foreground. I also want to talk about how Sahelanthropus being brought in here is kind of a callback to the Shagohod's airlift, and the choppers airlifting it off, and how I've been saying, Shago Village is the R&D platform. Well, this is the R&D platform, and we were the thing that was being developed, and that guy back at Heroes Way was us. Well, we're at the R&D platform, and if this Sahelanthropus is being likened to the Shagohod, Shago Village, R&D platform, Sahelanthropus is Shagohod, it's all kind of here. That guy that we take out in that first mission is kind of a symbolic Sahelanthropus, a little mini one. It's kind of us. And so that's where I'm getting the whole giant Chico thing from. It's literally implied that Sahelanthropus, at some point, they made a giant version of Chico. Probably whoever Fox was at that point, the young one, was probably taken back by Big Boss, and they probably did some crazy experiments on him and found a way to grow him. And that's probably really where the big and Big Boss comes from, if I had to guess. Just as a little thing to tie it in, there's a nice nursery rhyme that you probably know about Jack and the Beanstalk and the giant. And, Jack goes up the beanstalk and goes into this, place in the clouds, outer heaven. And he's trying to get this treasure, and a giant stomps on him. A giant gets mad at him. And there's all this stuff about, it's kind of Promethean a little bit. I think that's what's going on here. It's kind of a Jack and the Beanstalk story. And Jack's kind of tried to steal fire from heaven and ended up, kind of squishing himself, getting caught by the giant, and mash his bones to make his bread kind of stuff happens. And that's kind of the end. And it's about your will, right? It's about the legacy that you leave via your will in the world. And Sahelanthropus is a mark upon the world, and that's kind of why it's depicted in the way it is. It has no practical purpose. They don't literally mean to use Sahelanthropus in their wars and their schemes. It's really just there as a symbol. And that's what this whole game's story is really trying to tell you, is that if you go back and look at all this literal stuff in a symbolic way, there's a lot you can learn from it. And with that said, I hope you've learned a lot from this lecture. It's been a long one. If you've stuck with me, I appreciate it. I'll be back next time. We'll talk about Mission 32, To Know Too Much, and then the first repeat mission, C2W Subsistence Mode. It's a short mission to talk about, but there's a lot of context to talk about. So the next video, we'll get into what happens next. But hope you've enjoyed. With that said, peace.